Before we begin, we would also like to do a land acknowledgement. Although this panel is not situated in person, Students for Shelters does take place on the St. George campus. And so we would like to wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And now moving on to a little bit about S4S and our roles. For those of you who are new to Students for Shelters, it began 3 years ago as a recognized student group on St. George campus. Our founders, Hannah and Brianna, recently graduated and have turned Students for Shelters into an NGO, making us their first official chapter, and we're absolutely delighted. The mission of our group is to encourage the school community to take local action and donate smaller items to organizations that are not always thought of, such as socks and feminine hygiene products. We also strive to participate in other forms of action and raise awareness and act in solidarity with those in need. Our community unites students from diverse backgrounds and brings them together under one common objective, helping others. In turn, we are hoping to create a lasting impact on students and others' lives in a positive way. So now that I've been speaking for a few minutes, it's about time I formally introduce myself. My name is Frances and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the current co-president of Students for Shelters alongside Sarah Durante, and I'm beyond thrilled to be bringing back Illuminate this year. Thank you so much to our moderator, Professor Vicky Vizdos, our guests from Toronto North Support Services and the Distress Center of Greater Toronto, and to all of you, thank you so much for being here.
And hello, I'd like to introduce myself too. My name is Bea Kralji, and I'm one of the co-vice presidents for Students for Shelters. My pronouns are she, her, and I am really excited about the panel today, and I'm really happy that you all could join us. And just before we begin, the topic of this panel is mental health, and that includes covering some sensitive topics. So please feel free to take any breaks if you need, or take care of yourself throughout this panel however you need to, whether that's shut your camera off, get up, move your body a little bit, or if you need to, mute it if something difficult comes up, but please take the space you need to take care of yourselves. Okay, so now we're going to begin by introducing the organizations and the speakers that we have with us today, beginning with Zara from the Distress Center of Greater Toronto. So just to introduce the organization, the Distress Center of Greater Toronto was founded in 1967, and it is the oldest volunteer-delivered service of crisis and emotional support, as well as suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention. Their services are available via phone, online chat, and text, and the volunteers also support the National Suicide Hotline and provide in-person individual and support groups for those who have lost loved ones to homicide or suicide. Other programs include multilingual helplines, elder abuse support lines, and outbound support services. And the call volume increases each year, as well as the program participants, with over 100,000 calls received annually. And today we have with us the wonderful speaker, Zara Mohammed Bai, and she began as a helpline volunteer for the Distress Center of Greater Toronto in March of 2017, as she was pursuing a science degree in psychology at York University. And after a year, she began mentoring new volunteers through individual phone coaching and helped to build their confidence to independently support service users on the lines. In July 2020, she was employed as a program assistant, where she continued regular support for volunteers, answered inbound calls, and oversaw the elder abuse department. In August 2021, she was promoted to a program support coordinator, where she expanded her responsibilities on the inbound programs and involvement in organizational efforts. She has a penchant for talking and initially volunteered in hopes of overcoming her phone anxiety, but it has now led to a promising future in mental health services. And in her free time, Zara enjoys listening to podcasts and music, reading books, and keeping her indoor plants alive. You can just wave and say hello. Yay.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Bea. Now we're going to quickly cover Toronto North Support Services and the members that are here with us today. So we have Jenna, Margot, and Sarah from TNSS, which is a community-based multi-service agency providing mental health and homeless programs to adults in Toronto. Their mission is to facilitate the recovery of individuals experiencing mental illness or homelessness by providing flexible community-based support and outreach services. TNSS is dedicated to ensuring that individuals living with mental illness and or experiencing homelessness receive the same opportunities and entitlements as all other members of society. They believe in the inherent ability of individuals experiencing mental illness and or homelessness to make positive changes in their lives and are honored to be a part of that process. So first we have Jenna, who's a registered social worker graduating from Ryerson School of Social Work in 2016. Jenna has been working in the field for 5.5 years, with the bulk of her work supporting folks experiencing homelessness in Toronto's downtown east. Jenna has been working at Toronto North Support Services on the multidisciplinary outreach team since December 2019, starting as a case manager and is now the team lead. Jenna has worked for various organizations as a housing worker and a health center supporting clients and creating various programming for harm reduction drop-in folks who use drugs, and as a case manager on a mobile health bus. Jenna has experience supporting folks with mental and physical health issues, including those living with HIV and Hep C. Jenna holds a certificate in trauma counseling for frontline workers and has completed level 1 narrative therapy training. She values community care and the lived experiences of those she supports, often seeing them as her biggest teachers. The second person from Toronto North Support Services we have today is Margot Wilkins, who is a social service graduate from Camosun College in Victoria, BC, and has been working in the human services sector for 15 years. Margot has experience in different community-based work, including working with seniors, people with disabilities, and people living with HIV. Margot has been working in Toronto North Support Services for 5 years and started as a case manager with the multidisciplinary outreach team, then became a team lead for MDOT. Once COVID hit, MDOT was funded to provide mental health case management services in the shelter and hotels across the city of Toronto. TNSS knew they needed Margot's expertise to help create, guide, and grow the program, and she accepted the role of team lead on the MDOT hotel team. Margot's passion is working for the houseless individuals living with mental illness and has been an essential part in making the program what it is today. Finally, we have Sarah Collins, who has an extensive history working with marginalized communities and identifies as an advocate, community organizer, and someone who likes to get things done. In 2006, Sarah completed a diploma in social service work for Seneca College and graduated as valedictorian. Sarah has been working at Toronto North Support Services for over 15 years in various programs, including street outreach, follow-up, mental health and justice, coordinated access to care from hospital, and the multidisciplinary access to care and housing program. Sarah returned to school in 2016 and completed her Bachelor of Family and Community Social Services and Guelph Humber, and then in 2021, graduated with a Master's in Health Administration from Ryerson University. Sarah is a registered member of the Canadian College of Health Leaders and has been an active member since 2019. Sarah's current role is the Director of Mental Health and Homeless Services and oversees the downtown services of Toronto North Support Services, which includes Catch, MDOT, MDOT Hotel, and Match. Sarah is dedicated to providing solid leadership and advocacy. She's committed to understanding the needs of vulnerable populations and creating programming that is a low barrier, flexible, and targeted to meet those needs. So now that we've covered everyone who's here at the panel with us, they all sound so lovely and are incredibly qualified. We're very excited that they decided to speak at this event. I'm going to pass it over to our club moderator, club validator, and U of T professor, Vicki Bizbiz. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Thank you so much, Frances and Bea, and thank you, Toronto North Support Services and the Distress Centre of Greater Toronto, particularly Jenna, Margot, Sarah, and Zara. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm just going to jump right into it and ask you guys, what would you mind elaborating on your organization's mission and your role in the organization? In other words, what does working in this field in Toronto look like? So why don't we start with Toronto North Services? Feel free to jump in, either Jenna, Margot, or Sarah, or all of you. What do you do in your organization?
Hi, everybody, and thank you for having us. Wow, Toronto North Support Services is an agency that originally, as per the name, started in North York of Toronto, and the majority of our programs still run out of North York To this day, we have mental health community case management, some mental health and justice teams, Tamil seniors drop-in and case management programs, and French language services. Many years ago, it feels like now, we were asked by the City of Toronto to provide a specialized service working with inner city health associates to create a multidisciplinary team that would meet the needs of homeless individuals in all of Toronto, where we would team up with a couple other agencies. South Riverdale Community Health Center would provide nursing to the team. Inner City Health Associates would provide psychiatry to the team. And Toronto North Support Services, CODA, and LOFT would come together and provide some mental health case management, housing, and develop mental ABI services. So that started in 2006, and we created this team, which has evolved over time. And that kind of moved us into the downtown core, as we had no geographical area. We grew since then based on the need of the community. And I think that's one thing that I really value about working at TNSS, is that we really take inventory of what's going on in the community and try and create innovative programming to meet the need of what's happening specifically in the community, and specifically with mental health and homeless services. So we have a program called CATCH, which is Coordinated Access to Care from Hospital. We have case managers that go into the hospitals, emergency rooms, and inpatient units. Any client that is homeless that comes to the hospital, they're connected to one of our case managers. What we were finding is that there were lots of clients who were coming in, they were identified as homeless and being discharged to nothing. So we created a program where the case manager could meet with them in hospital, do some really critical time intervention, and then continue to work with them in the community. We noticed that the MDOT and CATCH were both transitional programs, and we needed some to create a long-term case management program, multidisciplinary, to meet the needs, the long-term ongoing needs of folks that we were working with on those two teams. So we were able to create MATCH, which is the Multidisciplinary Access to Care and Housing Program. And that is also another partnership with Inner City Health Associates, where they provide us now it's up to 3.5 days of psychiatry. We have housing subsidies that we were able to apply for and get for that unit, because obviously working with the homeless population, having access to housing is a huge barrier. So we have some housing that comes with that, and then it's long-term case management, and the nurse that works on MDOT continues the transition of working with clients as they move into long-term housing and stability with a case manager. And then recently, as mentioned, the pandemic hit, the shelter system went into complete chaos, and we were able to expand MDOT to meet the needs of encampment folks and people living outdoors, but also to create this other program, MDOT Hotel, which is about 17 staff who are currently working, providing mental health case management in 12 of the hotels, shelter hotels that were created across the city of Toronto. So our teams go in, and clients that need a little bit of higher level of support than the on-site staff can provide, we go in and do intensive case management, mental health case management, and work with Inner City Health Associates. Again, they have nursing and psychiatry and doctors on site to help meet health needs of our clients, as well, focus on housing and getting people stabilized in the community. So I think in terms of our mission, one thing that I love is the flexibility and the being able to be fluid throughout our work and kind of bend and break. I found a lot of programs in the city that are, you need to fit into our box. And unfortunately, the homeless population living with mental illness and experiencing substance use challenges, they don't fit into any box. We need to bend and break our services and our missions to be able to meet them and meet their needs. And I that's one thing that I really, really appreciate about working here, is having the flexibility to do so.
Thank you, Sarah. That's amazing. So it seems like there are a lot of moving parts to this organization. You've got a lot of interventions at different stages of the health industry, and also getting housing as well. Yeah. Zara, tell us a little bit about the Distress Centre of Greater Toronto.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for the warm welcome. Our mission at the Distress Center is to ensure that individuals in our community that are at risk and at their most vulnerable have 24-hour anonymous and confidential support. So our main crisis and emotional distress services are through our inbound programs, where a person can call our number, they can connect to a trained volunteer and speak to them for 20 minutes, unless it's a crisis situation. We also have online chat and text support for those who do not prefer to speak over the phone. We also have outbound services. So we have a telecheck program for seniors for medication reminders. We have a caller reassurance program. So people going through transition periods. So coming out of the hospital, what do you do after that? We check in with those people. They can register for our program and have that ongoing support. In terms of working in this field, in Toronto specifically, I think it's interesting to be able to see how events happening within Peel and within Toronto affect the lives of people in our community. And that's reflected in the calls that we receive. We are privileged to get an intimate look into the everyday problems that people experience. It's not easy for people to be vulnerable and open, but I think having that confidentiality aspect to our helplines makes it more easy for people to open up about their feelings. We tend to get many repeat callers as well, a lot of frequent callers. So over time, when you're on the lines enough, they begin to recognize your voices, you develop rapport, and it helps build that extra layer of connection with callers, and being able to be a continuous support through their journey of improving themselves. So, yeah.
Thank you, Zara. That's enormously helpful. Thank you. This question is particularly directed to Jenna, Margot, and Sarah at Toronto North Services. We're going to come back to the Distress Centre, but what do you think some of the greatest misconceptions people have about homelessness? Because I think it does have ideological baggage. And what is some of that that you might confront on a day-to-day basis?
So I would say probably the biggest one, which I don't think is new to anyone, but often what we hear is that it's like the biggest is that it's the person's moral failing, that the person must have done something to end up here, that they didn't work hard enough. Like we have a very prevalent like neoliberal colonial Western worldview when we think of like, you're just supposed to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like if you work hard enough, you'll get the job done. And that's just not the case. I also think that folks, one of the biggest misconceptions is that folks experiencing homelessness all have mental health and substance use issues, and that's also just not the case. I think that there is this rhetoric that people are out there collecting money, a check, social assistance rates, like the Ontario Works Basic Needs is $373 for the entire month, and ODSP is $672. So I think that's a lot of the misconceptions that people come up against, and that homelessness is easy to get out of. And we know that the longer that you're in it is the harder that it is to get out. It's extremely hard to get a job if you don't have an address, you don't have a phone, you don't have access to services, you don't have access to showers, you don't have access to like all of the things that I think a lot of folks take for granted. People don't have access to, and then it's extra complicated once COVID hit, of course, right? So, yeah.
That's really helpful, Jenna. So your mission, Toronto North's mission, is to facilitate recovery of individuals experiencing mental illness or homelessness by providing flexible community-based support and outreach services. So do you think there's a relationship between homelessness and mental illness? Because we talked about some of the misconceptions, but Jenna, you did a really good job of sort of suggesting that maybe mental illness isn't necessarily a factor of homelessness, but does it at times intersect?
Yeah, so I think that mental health and homelessness is not like mutually exclusive. I think someone can be living with a mental health diagnosis and maybe not have an adequate support system. Perhaps they come into contact with the justice system, or they lose their job, and then they might become homeless. And, they're also might be someone that becomes homeless for the first time, and it has nothing to do with their mental health. But the trauma of becoming homeless, entering the shelter system, depending on the shelter that you go to, it's not a super glamorous place. There's, you know, various shelters across the city of Toronto that can potentially like exacerbate or, you know, create a mental health issue potentially, right? So I think some folks become homeless and they're also okay. So I think that there can be a correlation, but I don't think that there's a causation between the two necessarily.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That's great. I think when people talk about mental health and its relation to homelessness, they mainly also think about substance abuse. One of the stereotypes that we talked about was, you know, mental health issues, but another common misconception is linked to substance abuse. Are there other mental health disorders that people tend not to consider as a cause, or they seem not to sympathize with as much?
Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, I made like a couple notes and I lost my spot.
It's okay, Jenna.
Give me 1 second. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. So I guess when I was thinking about this question, I was like, kind of like, oh, I didn't realize that, like, you know, the main thought was around substance use and homelessness. I know it's a conversation that folks have, but I guess I, you know, in my work support folks that don't use substances and or in recovery and are actively homeless. So there's that. You know, I often also think about when we think about other kind of like mental health diagnosis and stuff like that, I also kind of think about discrimination and like racism in healthcare and things of that nature. And how people can present, you know, someone with living with type 1 diabetes might present like they are intoxicated or that they're wobbly, or someone with a brain injury may present that they with behavioral issues or poor impulse control or memory loss stuff. And it looks like a diagnosis of schizophrenia, but it's not.
Yeah.
So those are kind of some of the things that I kind of think about in regards to that.
That's very helpful, Jenna. Thank you. This has opened up to both groups, both Toronto North and the Distress Centre. Looking more broadly at Toronto, how do you believe our evolving understanding of the importance of mental health has changed the approach to helping the local homeless population? In other words, what have we learned that changes our approach to helping people with mental illness and mental health issues? And I think this is particularly pronounced during the pandemic.
So I think our evolving understanding and destigmatization of mental health can lead to increased empathy and compassion for the homeless population. COVID is a big example of how quickly life can change, and particularly how mental health can be impacted in a second.
Yeah.
And Jenna kind of touched upon this earlier, but I think we have a lot of incorrect preconceived notions about the homeless population. And sometimes we think that individuals are homeless because they have made a bad decision. Yet I think two people making the same decision can have two very different outcomes based on a lot of predetermined factors or factors out of their control, such as how easy can they access mental health? Can they afford to pay for it? Do they have to wait through OHIP, which can take several months to get some kind of treatment? What is their current financial status? So I think that sociocultural piece is very important as well. And unfortunately, it disproportionately impacts a lot of marginalized and low-income communities. So I think overall, having a better understanding about this can lead to a better conversation about it. And the empathy and compassion piece are a great stepping stone to awareness and taking some action.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Zara. Thank you so much. Just to continue this discussion with you, Zara, at the Distress Centre, COVID-19 has clearly, I think, exacerbated many mental health issues. Clearly, has there been anything else that maybe has exacerbated, or even COVID, mental health issues experienced by people that you speak to? And did you find that there was a demographic that was impacted the most? Maybe there were trends in, say, gender or ethnicity.
Yeah, absolutely. There were many trends that we discovered in this last year during the pandemic. I think it may be obvious to most that isolation and loneliness increased, rates of depression increased, and anecdotally, domestic and child abuse increased. We know through our data through victim services that there was a huge impact on domestic violence rates. With children, they didn't have that safeguard in place anymore. That was a school for someone to be able to detect these types of things. So I know right after children went back to school, the amount of calls that Children's Aid Society was getting skyrocketed. And that was an unfortunate consequence to the pandemic. In terms of exacerbation, we noticed an increase in aggressive and frustrated callers. And I think callers' emotions tend to escalate more quickly as well. And that's a trend that we notice nationally across agencies in Canada. We also have another service called Crisis Link, and that's a free phone service at all TTC stations that's intended to help prevent and limit death by train. We noticed that the suicide deaths on the TTC also increased. And it's also important to consider that these deaths don't just impact the victim, it impacts the driver, it impacts the people on the train who saw that. So these are definitely some unfortunate trends that we noticed. In terms of gender impacts, I think the way that we talk about our services are that it's available to everybody. So we kind of say that no problem is too big or small. And as a result, I think it makes our demographics look quite varied. So we didn't particularly notice a difference or gender impact or ethnic impact. I would say pretty much all across the board, we had an increase in just new callers, frequent callers of every kind.
That's really interesting. There was a piece in the Washington Post a few weeks ago that said the number of murders in the United States is the highest it's been since 1960. And a lot of that had to do, this peak in the 60s, and I think it had a lot to do with exactly what you're talking about, Zara. So the anecdotal information that you're giving, it has been grounded now in statistical data, which is really troubling. But I think it emphasizes the importance of what you do. Now, this is for the Distress Centre and also Toronto North. We'll start with you, Zara, and then we'll move on to Toronto North. In some ways, you've answered this, but has COVID-19 impacted the day-to-day function of your organisation? Maybe outreach and assistance services have changed. Has the support of resources usually granted to your organisation changed throughout the COVID-19 pandemic? Are there particular areas of concern that now get more or maybe less attention?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I did answer a little bit of this in the previous question, but I'll just repeat myself anyway. There is definitely an increased demand in callers with a need to take more factors into consideration, such as the exacerbated loneliness. I think our existing callers may become more in need of support, and there could be potential frustration when those needs aren't being met. So for example, if their other coping mechanisms aren't available, they rely on us more. But because everyone also requires our supports more, the wait times are longer. The amount of responders we have may not be on par to our demand. So it ends up being a bit of a domino effect where all of these mild frustrations add up. And sometimes we experience kind of the cascade of that on the lines when speaking to callers. In terms of our outreach and assistance services, we have the benefit that primarily our services are through the phone. So that didn't change too much, but our standalone in-person program, which is the Survivor Support Program, where we do in-person support groups for those who have lost loved ones to homicide and suicide, that definitely changed, and that platform had to transition to virtual. But overall, it was more of an internal system switch. So before, volunteers would have to go into our call centers. We had one in Brampton, we had one in Mississauga, and then Toronto and North York. So all volunteers would have to commute and go to the center to be able to answer calls. With COVID and the centers being shut down, we then had to find a way to transition all of our services to answering calls remotely. That's something we were able to do within a couple of weeks, and we got all volunteers set up, all staff set up to be able to continue our lines and be able to support people from home. And that was a great change for us. In terms of the support granted to our organization, I think it increased this last year, especially because mental health and COVID-19 increased mental health awareness. And so there were a lot of emergency grants for nonprofits. However, it's not the same this year. And so we have this added challenge where we're potentially working with that same increase in callers and increased aggression and increased mental health issues due to COVID, but then the level of support and funds just aren't there. And that's kind of a recurring problem right now for a lot of nonprofit organizations.
That's really interesting, Zara. Thank you, because in some ways it might get even more challenging now that we're on, the way out, so to speak, from the pandemic. What about Toronto North, Jenna, Margot, and Sarah? How did COVID change your day-to-day function of the organization?
Well, in terms of our day-to-day function, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, we kind of had to adjust the way that we were thinking about working with our clients. But in terms of the M.Dot outreach program, we're essential service, so we were still continuing to go out into the community and see our clients as we were before. However, we'd have to wear PPE, which was a little bit awkward especially when we're trying to work with people that are sleeping outside or have a really high level of mental health issues. Having to show up with a mask on can be a little off-putting for people, but I think everybody got used to it. And then in terms of our other programs, we have the match program that Sarah talked about, the catch program. Those had to have a lot more of an adjustment. So the hospital, catch couldn't go into the hospital as much, so they had to do work from home. And also with match, there was a lot of over the phone support happening, and that makes it a lot more challenging when we're talking about people that have issues already with isolation, with lack of community. So trying to create a community within a Zoom call or within a phone, over the phone and stuff like that. But thankfully, our teams and our programs are really innovative, and the people that we work with are really creative about how to do that. And then of course, when things were happening and we knew that people were in trouble, of course we would go and see them, even in our other programs where it was mostly on the phone. There was a couple of times where people just had to go and knock on doors and see how people were doing. I think in terms of working in this field, how things changed was we weren't able to access the same kind of services and resources that we were. So basically our program runs off referring people, taking people to places, making sure that they're getting their needs met. And that had to change a lot, where we had to be a lot more creative about how we were doing that. And in some instances, seeing an apartment, for instance, we had to, do that over the phone or with, over Zoom, with a landlord and stuff like that, which was a lot more challenging for people. And for us, working from a remote sort of place. But I think now that it's been a couple of years or a year and a half, has it been 2 years? I think it's been a year and a half. We've sort of, I don't know, I can't even remember how long it's been now.
It's a blur.
As things are coming together, we're still coming back to normal, I guess, or whatever normal was before. We're still having to hang on to some of those things that we've changed, but they're good. Being able to get some of our folks that have never used a computer, showing them how to use a computer. We were able to access phones for homeless people. We had I think it was with TELUS, gave us a bunch of phones. So we were able to show people how to use phones and give them phones to be able to access those resources and stuff like that. So, yeah. It changed, but it didn't.
Yeah, it seems like, you know, the objectives were still there, but it seems like there were practical barriers. Like, how do you show an apartment, you know, online maybe is different than showing it in person, I guess. Did I understand that correctly? Are those sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, that's like one, you know, we work from like a housing first perspective, so we're trying to get people into housing. So even with some of our folks that are sleeping rough outside, our objective is still to get them indoors. And so even if it's like a transitional housing program, some of these transitional housing programs weren't even allowing people to come and see the spaces before they were able to access them. So we had to sort of be creative about how we were showing people like where they could potentially be living, leaving their space, leaving where they were comfortable, and going into this unknown environment was super challenging.
Yeah, Margot, that's hard. I didn't realize that there were that many barriers. That's really interesting. This is for all of you. What are some of the new perspectives that you've gained from COVID-19 pandemic? Are they positive or negative? And how do you think they'll impact your work and the overall field?
Go ahead, Margot. Go ahead, Margot. I know it was like
I'm on a roll.
who unmuted first.
And then Zara. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I think a lot of what we were seeing, or a lot of what I've been thinking about as I've been trying to think about how to answer this question, have actually been fairly positive. So, I mean, homelessness and mental health has been stigmatized always, even before, you know, the pandemic. And folks living outside and folks with mental health issues have been dealing with the epidemic of drug overdose and the housing crisis from the beginning. So that's nothing new. Like living on this like day to day, trying to cope and trying to get ahead hasn't changed for them. So, but there was like a more of a spotlight on that stigmatization, and a lot of the community members who never really focused on that before, or just kind of thought, oh, these people are being helped by agencies, or, you know, there's a lot of resources out there for folks who are realizing that maybe there really wasn't. So I've seen a lot of, you know, people in the community coming more together to try and help people like living in encampments and stuff like that, you know, which is really quite a positive change, because those are the things that'll make long-term changes, is people recognizing that these are the things within our community that we as community members need to change together, not just folks that are working in this field, and not just the homeless or mental health folks, you know, trying to do it themselves. It takes a community to change, you know, some of these things. So also we've had like bigger system changes that have been really positive, like safe supply. You know, we've had the introduction of SIS sites and OPS sites within the hotel programs. The hotel programs themselves have been kind of life-changing for a lot of our clients. And then we're not working in silos anymore. We're working together as a community, where the agencies are coming together to try and help people. So we're working in like a multifaceted, multidisciplinary, dare I say that, in a way in the Toronto area. So we have clinical folks, and, you know, social workers and frontline staff all coming together to try and focus on how do we help people with mental health, how do we help people living outside, how, you know, and precariously housed or homeless, to sort of move on and be safe from not only the COVID epidemic, but also the overdose epidemic and the housing crisis.
That's so interesting, Margot, because when we started, and Sarah did a wonderful job of kind of explaining what Toronto North Services does, it seemed like there were discrete sort of bodies that all come together. But what you're describing, if I understand you correctly, is also the community now is another sort of body that has been, so to speak, figuratively, that has been incorporated into this, that maybe not may have not have been the case before the pandemic. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's really amazing to see like how, you know, within, because I work in the hotel project, so we work within these buildings where we are one program coming in and working with agencies that have provided these spaces for folks. And so we're coming into their space and entering into their culture of work and aligning our sort of work with their work and working together collaboratively to help people move on, stabilize, get the things that they need so that they can live a better life or live a life that they want to in a safe way. So it's kind of neat in that way. And we've made a lot of, it's almost like a big networking, you know, a way of networking. And we've been able to create these partnerships and resources together. And it's, I could see that this is going to be something that is going to move forward even after the pandemic is long behind us.
Yes, yes.
Someday.
And it's great. Yes, one day. But it's so great that the community is part of that network. Zara, what's been happening at the Distress Center in terms of, I guess, the impacts of COVID-19?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of perspectives that we've gained from it, I think it's the relatability in mental health issues and coping with everyday stressors in life. I think the pandemic was a universal experience that everyone was going through in different ways, which I think allowed people to be a little more accepting of the way we're handling such types of stressors. In terms of specifically my work and the overall field, I think in terms of demand, it's very much increased. Like I talked about before, the shift towards doing more remote work. That was also a positive impact because with the ability for volunteers to be able to answer calls from home, it broadens our catchment of volunteers and we can get more support that way as well and more responders to get to our increased demand in callers. I think the pandemic also showed the value in accessibility for these services being available. And this sort of deviates, I think, from your question, but I think it's important to bring up just about how mental health issues are prevalent in our community. And I think by getting new callers on the helpline, it broadened my perspective on exactly what people in our community face. I think prior to that, we were getting calls from a certain pool of people that are more likely to use our services that may not be able to afford counseling. But with COVID and being able to hear other perspectives that is happening within our community, it was really valuable. We would have so many calls where people would say, you know, I've never used this service before. I don't really know what to talk about, but I just know that I'm not feeling really good with everything going on. And speaking to people like that was very valuable. I think it's easy to depersonalize yourself when we constantly have this overstimulation of sad news happening around the world. And as a way to preserve our well-being, sometimes you have to block that out. But I think it's important to focus a little more on what the people around us are going through. And I think that awareness can perhaps lead us to supporting our loved ones better. And most importantly, being able to be a good support system for yourself and being able to care for yourself when your mental health is being compromised.
Yeah, it's a kind of empathetic engagement that also enriched your life, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Zara. This question is also for Toronto North, and it speaks to a timely issue because earlier this year, many homeless individuals in Toronto were evicted from their personal shelters or tents downtown by the city of Toronto. Now, what were some of the mental health consequences of this, do you think?
I think that the biggest mental health consequence of this was that it exacerbated trauma. Many people who are homeless, they've experienced traumatic events in their lives, and I think that this was a huge trigger for trauma. There's a reason why people are living outdoors and in encampments, and you know there were community members building individual shelters, constructing individual shelters for people that felt safe because they could keep warm even in the colder. And then the city was unfortunately coming and taking them down because some of them were, obviously concerns for fire hazard. So I think that it took away people's choice and autonomy. There are reasons, again, that people are not in shelters. They have been potentially assaulted. Many issues that go on in there. We're definitely not going to be naive to think that those are always safe spaces. People having trauma and then coming in and having to share a room with 4 other people that they don't know. Like, I wouldn't want to do that myself, let alone, it can definitely trigger trauma. So I would say that trauma was the biggest one, that biggest mental health consequence of people's personal spaces and tents being deconstructed.
Yeah, I can definitely see that, Sarah. In relation to that question, and this is for all of you, more broadly, what role do governments and their policies have in these kinds of issues?
Well, I definitely think that there's a way to handle things. I think specifically with this event, the municipal government made a decision of how to evict people from public spaces. And I think that the city of Toronto is a big organization, so to speak, with many different parts. There are dedicated programs like SSHA and Streets to Homes that work with people who are homeless. And I don't feel that through this process that their opinions or the opinions of community workers who work very closely with this population were taken into consideration. I think that there absolutely could have been a better way to handle deconstruction of encampments, and I don't think that that was taken into account. I think that more collaboration with community organizations and community who work closely with these people and know them and know who they are could have been a huge beneficial piece to doing it a bit more peacefully and not continuing the role of trauma throughout.
Definitely, yeah, I agree, Sarah. What do you think the City of Toronto could have done differently in this situation to support housing or insecure or homeless individuals?
So I think I would repeat, more consultation with community that work, community organizations that work with these individuals, and more feedback from the actual population in the encampment. What do you need? Why are you here? What would you like? What would make this better? I think that would have been more helpful. I think I working with this population currently, that has changed. So right now there are still many encampments throughout the city of Toronto. The city of Toronto, Streets to Home specifically, and SSHA, who are the organizations that work with homeless individuals, have pulled together community resources. They currently have a pilot project that there is housing, there are units. They're working in one specific park to see if it can work well, and it has. The number of tents have decreased, and they're literally going out to people and saying, why are you here? What do you need? Would you go into housing? This is a list of housing that we have. Is this an area in which you would like to move into? Okay, great. What do you need to do it? You need to get your taxes done. Let's get them done. You need finances. Let's get that done. You need ID. Let's get that done. They're providing the resources to the space, and people are agreeing to move inside, which has been a much more successful route. It may take more time because a lot of the individuals that we work with, it takes time to build trust and rapport. You can't just throw things at them and expect them to follow through or do as I say. It doesn't work like that. They're individuals who have rights and opinions and all of those fun things. So it's really figuring out what it is that they want and how can we help facilitate that. And the opposite side to that is that one pilot project has now grown. So now Streets to Homes, because they are affiliated with the city, sometimes people don't want to work with them because of that affiliation. No matter how great the workers are, there's that affiliation. So right now there's a group of peer support workers in the city who are with an organization, St. Stephen's, in the neighborhood group, that are going into encampments and working with people and building those relationships, and then calling the other resources from streets to homes in to say, this is what this person wants. Let me facilitate that and do the work, rather than you coming in and kind of taking it up, which has been hugely successful.
Yeah, that's interesting, Sarah, because that seems to be another consequence then, this erosion of trust that is so crucial to the daily work that you do. Yeah. And also, I think Margot was saying this earlier, the way that community has now become a partner in this, and perhaps in ways that it hadn't been beforehand. You know, it seems those evictions didn't really, you know, enable that connection that would have been really valuable. Yeah, thanks for that, Sarah. So these are other general questions related to mental health. Certainly, Zara, they might be in your purview, but they're certainly open to both. So what are some of the indicators or warning signs that someone is experiencing mental health issues and may need support? What are some of the red flags, do you think?
So there are a lot of common indicators that I think a lot of us know. So change in mood, withdrawal, lack of self-care, that can suggest mental health issues, but I think it also varies among people. So the best way is just to ask and communicate. I think that's a big thing that I learned on my helpline, that a behavior that may be normal from one person could be indicative of a mental health issue in someone else. Also, conveying words, the way you say something can translate very differently to different people. So I think always paraphrasing, always confirming, and always communicating and making sure you're both on the same page is important when you're looking at some indicators and warning signs.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So say we know someone who may be suffering from mental illness or struggling with their mental health, maybe severe anxiety or panic attacks in our personal lives or in the community. How can we offer support? What can we do to help?
Yeah, there's so many different ways that you can help someone that you're concerned for. I think it's important to educate yourself mostly on what they're going through. So the communication aspect, let them know that you've noticed that they were acting a little bit different maybe, and just want to check in and make sure that they're okay. Ask them how you can best support them. And I think Sarah kind of touched on this earlier when we were talking about the homeless population. It's so important to directly just communicate with who you're worried about, and ask them what they best need, because people are sometimes hoping for something different in terms of a level of involvement from social supports, for example. Some people could thrive and their mental health can improve when they're getting continuous support and check-in from family and friends. Others may find that overwhelming, or it could be a source of stress for them. So it's important to kind of ensure what you're doing is what they need and what they're hoping to get out of a social support. I think it's also important to listen and support without judgment. Active listening skills are very important. It may sound like common sense, or active listening may sound like an easy skill, but it's really not. And I think talking to people on the lines really forces you to practice active listening skills. We do not have the benefit of seeing nonverbal cues, seeing expressions on your face, for example. What are you doing? Body language. So we're relying completely on what a person is telling us over the phone. So it's very important then translating that to in person, where you listen without judgment, you actively listen to what they're saying. Find local crisis numbers. So if they don't want to speak to you, find numbers, find counseling. Again, check in with what they're looking for, but these are just, a bunch of different options that you could use. Looking at peer support groups if they're not comfortable talking to a loved one. And I also think it's important to not take things personally. So that kind of ties into listening without judgment. So for instance, if you reach out to somebody and they don't want your help right now, or they can't tell you what they need, or you may feel like they're pushing you away, I think it's important to remind yourself not to minimize what you're doing, and also maintain that patience that a lot of times mental health issues can cloud your judgment, and it's very difficult to navigate through these already challenging emotions and then be able to coherently communicate what you're hoping for out of another person. So if they're not responsive, then respect that and then try again if you're still worried about them, and just keep trying to reach out periodically, because at the end of the day, you can only help someone as much as they want to help themselves. So it's important to do those check-ins here and there, but then know where your limit is and where to draw back sometimes.
That's really helpful. And you mentioned these support lines. I know one component of your community organization is the 408 helpline. Did you notice the day-to-day calls change before and after the pandemic? I know you mentioned earlier that there's higher levels of aggression. It seems people are feeling it. Did it change?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I brought up earlier in terms of the increased aggression and frustration, that's definitely something we noticed with our regular callers. With new callers calling in, we noticed we were getting many more new aggressive callers that would begin their calls with a high level of frustration and irritation, and needing some type of outlet to let that out on. And I would say the angry callers, that just the frequency as well, the frequency of our regular callers. A lot of times they are coping with some sort of everyday condition. It could be a severe mental health issue. It could be a physical condition. It could be isolation and loneliness. And with COVID, all of their other coping mechanisms were suddenly gone, especially if it's something outside of the house. So their reliance on us increased. Our ability to deal with it was on par or may have decreased because of our lack of responders and lack of being able to keep up with it. And that definitely did lead to increased frustration and anger.
So just as a therapeutic intervention, what do you do, Zara? Do you de-escalate, like when you get someone like that?
Yeah. So I think it's important to remind yourself, and I brought this up earlier, but not taking things personally.
Right.
These emotions were already existent before they started talking to you.
Yeah.
So I give them the platform to let it out and express their frustration in the way that feels the best to them, but also ensure that I am preserving my own mental health by establishing limits and boundaries. So if that anger and frustration starts to transition to being projected onto the responder and onto me, then that's where I would establish limits and remind them that this is a space to openly express your thoughts without judgment. And it should be done in a respectful way. So it definitely was a bit of a challenge when, I'm training new volunteers, that had to become more of an important skill to teach volunteers about establishing boundaries, establishing limits, warning callers if it becomes excessive. But I think before doing that, it's just important to give them the space to just let it out and make them feel validated, make them feel heard, and not mirroring that same level of aggression and anger. I think that can be difficult not to do, and respond with the same level of aggression at times. But keeping a calm demeanor and speaking to them softly, calmly, a lot of times they can end up mirroring that same tone. So I found that would be helpful. Yeah.
That's really practical, great advice. Thanks, Zara. So what are some of the misconceptions or the misconstrued ideas surrounding people who call?
So I think when I train new volunteers, I think the most common misconstrued idea that we get is that every single call is a suicide or a crisis call. So they tend to amp themselves up. They're incredibly anxious and think that they'll be speaking to somebody who's feeling suicidal during every interaction, when that is very much not the case. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of people call to cope with loneliness, isolation, a multitude of mental health issues. So we get callers who call every single day, sometimes multiple times a day. Then we'll get callers every couple of days or every couple of weeks when they know that they're feeling particularly anxious and we happen to be a coping mechanism. Then they'll just check in with us and talk to us only when there's a specific problem. But by no means are all of them suicide or crisis level. our services are also a prevention service. So having these services for people to call and cope with their everyday stressors also helps prevent people from getting worse and getting to that level of crisis or suicidality. So yeah, very, very misconstrued idea that people always come into with it. But it definitely isn't the case. I would say probably about 70% of our callers are repeat callers, repeat and frequent callers. So it's definitely, yeah.
So they're looking for kind of counseling and support in many ways. Yeah.
Absolutely.
What kind of demographic are they? If I can ask.
Yeah, it very much varies, quite honestly. So in terms of age, I would say our most common age would be between 25 to 55 would be the most common. But then we also have quite a prevalent pool of seniors who are experiencing isolation, loneliness, live in assisted living, and have no one else to talk to. And so we get quite a lot of those sort of callers. We don't have a lot of information about our callers' income situation. It's only what they end up telling us. But I think generally our callers do end up being from a lower income population since we are a free support. And those are some of the trends that we've usually noticed.
Thanks, Zara, and thanks for the work you do. So this is for all of you. Do you believe having programs that bring awareness to mental health would improve the understanding of this topic in addition to increasing the chances of people getting help?
So, I mean, I was thinking about this one too, and when we think about programs, I think the first thing that comes to mind are like things like, you know, Bell Let's Talk and big programs like that, and companies that are trying to bring awareness of mental health to sort of like a broader audience, or, you know, to just everyday people. And I think that those are really great, but a lot of what is focused on is, you know, anxiety, depression, things that people, like, I think pretty much everybody can say that they've dealt with that at some point, and it's all really important conversations to have. I think where it kind of stops is when we start talking about some of the more severe mental health issues, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, you know, borderline personality disorder. And these are the ones that really, really affect people and the way that they're able to go about their daily lives, the way that they're able to interact in the community and access services. And those are the mental health issues that I personally would like to see more normalized. And I think the way to do that is to bring more programs into all of the community, like into neighborhoods, into more community support. So, you know, we see a lot of those things in like the downtown core of Toronto, or even, you know, just kind of scattered through the more, you know, just outside of Toronto. But as you start to go further out, there's less of those things that people are able to access. Smaller communities, you know, have maybe one place, and everybody knows each other. There's a level of, there's a, you know, you can kind of like go to these programs here in the city or in other larger cities or larger communities, and you won't be afraid that you're going to walk in and you're going to know the person behind the desk, or know the person that's answering the phone. Where in other communities, it could be, you know, somebody that you know, and that can be incredibly scary. So I think normalizing mental health in all communities, including communities outside of the city, and having access to them and more access to them. So being able to just go down the street and have those kinds of services offered, or even more services in hospitals that are, you know, more like drop-in services or easily accessible, lower barrier accessible services.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Margot. There was a piece in the CBC a couple of days ago about increased numbers of homelessness in rural populations because the house prices have gone up and rental prices have gone up so much because there's been a mass exodus out of the city. into these smaller communities, there are now a lot more displaced people there who can't afford regular housing. And so what you were saying about these smaller communities not giving people the kind of anonymity that you might have in a larger city, it's really timely as well, because I think the pandemic has really changed the way we see regions of homelessness. We often kind of assume it's an urban problem, but it's increasingly, it seems, becoming other areas of it's manifesting in other areas as well, where these interventions might be really useful.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny when you mention that because I used to actually work on an outreach van in York Region.
Yeah.
So I was providing mental health and homeless like supports to folks living in rural communities like up north of Newmarket, so like Sutton, Keswick, and even some of the communities like Maple and Vaughan and these, places where you don't think that there's homeless people, but I'll tell you, there are homeless people living in the ravines. There are homeless people living in, we had some people squatting in an old hotel up in Keswick that we would go and see all the time. And we were the only service that was providing anything for them. So we would bring them, twice a week, we would bring them sandwiches, a loaf of bread and stuff like that. And they didn't have access to anything else because because once they stepped out and went and tried to access, say, one of the walk-in clinics there, they were met with, people didn't want to deal with them because they were obviously homeless and obviously had mental health issues. So they were relying on us to basically provide them with basic needs.
Oh, Margot.
Just
Thank
to
you
jump
also.
in.
Yeah.
Sorry, Vicky, just to jump in for a second. I've been working
Sure, Sarah. Yeah.
for many years, and this is half the problem with the prices of housing in Toronto. Even within the city limits, we're experiencing that. So people who sleep outside rough downtown Toronto, the only housing options that they have through Toronto Community Housing, rent geared to income, which will meet their needs and help some of their financial issues, is in like the deepest depths of Scarborough, where there aren't any resources. So they're giving up their family health team, they're giving up their community, they're giving up all of these things. Yay, I got housing, so it's so great, and moving out to nothing. And it takes an hour and a half each way to transport into the downtown core to get to their regular connections. So it's for sure happening in small rural places outside of the city, but it's happening within the city as well. And that is, in my experience, one of the main reasons why people became homeless again, because they just couldn't do it, because they didn't have the supports, they didn't have the community built around them to be successful.
Yeah, Sarah, that's a really, really good point. Yeah. And also those supports become, I think, incredibly important if you are, Margot was talking about mental illnesses, say like schizophrenia, where you might need, a pretty diligent treatment regimen, and if you don't have that, I mean, you guys would know better than I do, but if you don't have that, then that risk might go up as well. Am I right to assume that?
So yes, absolutely. We do an assessment with all of our clients in our longer term programs, the Ontario Common Assessment of Needs. It goes through, it's a very extensive assessment to go through many areas of people's lives and what kinds of things that they want to work on. For our case managers who do longer term case management, it's a great way to kind of outline what the work looks like. But in receiving those back, the number one thing that people wanted was socialization. So it's not even that they care, like their mental health could be greatly impacted if they had resources to be able to socialize. And for some people, that is just going to the doctor, having access to go to the doctor and seeing people there, doing those types of things. So it is a very important piece that needs to be addressed throughout the city and in places where it's not as resource rich like it is downtown Toronto.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sarah, Margot, Jenna, and Zara. I'm going to pause my questions so I can open it up to other people, because I think I've been monopolizing you for a little while, which is a pleasure for me. But I imagine the people who are with us today also have questions. So I'd like to open it up to them as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and ask, or to type them in the chat. Looks like we have some in the chat. Francis and Bea, are you happy to navigate these questions? Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Why don't I read some of the questions that we've gotten in the chat while people think of what to ask. Okay, so we had one from Ellie while I think Zara was talking a while ago. And Ellie asks, I'm curious about any perceived difference in the conversations that take place on text, and if they come from a noticeable section of the population or concern certain issues in particular. So, yeah.
Thanks, Ellie, for that great question. In terms of the conversations that take place on text, so our texting services are a part of the national crisis line that our organization also answers calls for. So we have the distress centers of Greater Toronto, but there's also the Canadian Suicide Prevention Service, which is a national line more catered towards crisis and suicide calls that our volunteers also answer for. And the text services are a part of that. So naturally, a lot of our text prompts and people that reach out tend to be for suicidal ideation, suicidal risk. In terms of a noticeable section of the population, I would say definitely a younger demographic. So teenagers, young adults tend to use the text messaging function more often. I think also people that live with others, so a lack of privacy. And I think with COVID, that made it even more challenging to get any sort of privacy to speak over the phone. If someone's like me and has horrible phone anxiety, they may opt to use texting instead as well. But I would definitely say a lot of younger texters, I was about to say callers, but I guess texters or service users, and definitely more suicide oriented as well.
Thank you, Zara. I think that was our last chat question. Reese's question got answered in the chat. It is if no one has questions right now, I have one that I would love to ask to all of you. Honestly, everyone, even in the Zoom, can speak up, but I found recently I've been having some pretty difficult conversations with people that do not share the same exposure to conversations about health, like mental health and homelessness, that I have had. So how would you go about navigating discussions with people that approach the issue of homelessness as being someone's choice, or not empathizing with the structural difficulties that perpetuate homelessness, or like people that approach mental health, especially with COVID, the increase in diagnosis and increase in prevalence as being like an over exaggeration, or like they just diagnose anything these days and it's an excuse for people not to deal with their problems. How would you go about that? Please.
This sounds like Thanksgiving dinner at honestly.
No.
I'm just gonna say like how I approach this kind of thing, and I just kind of like ask people questions about like where they're getting their viewpoints from. So probing kind of like, okay, so you think homelessness is a choice, but like why do you think that? Where do you think people are coming from? How what is your experience when dealing with homeless people? I've never talked to anybody before. So okay, so then where do you get this understanding from? So a lot of times people have preconceptions about where people come from, or like in terms of like why they ended up on the street, or like dealing with folks with mental illness, like they've never experienced that before, so they don't have any understanding. So asking the right questions and sort of getting them to answer them in a way that gets them thinking about themselves, like bringing it back to who they are. Okay, so that's your experience, but what do you think other people's experience are in the world? Because you can't expect that everybody is going to have the same experience or have the same understanding of mental health and homelessness. And you're not going to change everyone's mind either. So I've had to let that go, especially with a couple of people in my family. But honestly, it's like an ongoing conversation and also being respectful of their opinion. So I find that coming at them with like, you know, like I feel myself getting angry sometimes, particularly with my uncle. I'm just gonna say it. So I just like come at him with like, oh, that's really an interesting point of view. Tell me more. And then I'll tell him my point of view. And then sort of engage in like a regular conversation and not make it an argument. Because once you start getting pissed off, I feel like then they get their back up and then there's no way of having the conversation anyway. So that's just how I deal with it.
I like your point about asking them questions. I've found like in other parts of my life, that's been the most efficient way to have a productive discussion, because that way it's not you trying to shine the light on someone or reveal that they don't know anything or that they're wrong. They get to realize, maybe I've been filling these gaps in my perspective with things that have no ground, but it's not you that's telling them that. So that was really helpful. Thank you. Looks like the
I would
chat
agree
has
with
agreed.
that. Definitely coming at it from a respectful way, but I also like to share experience and some stats sometimes. So, I have this multiple clients that we've worked with that are just like so fantastic. So sharing some of the stories, I had a guy who was on the street for multiple years, had, chronic alcohol abuse, but he had been in a car accident and witnessed his brand new baby daughter and his wife pass away. Like, no offense, if I'm in a situation like that, we're all one step away from a traumatic event or something that happens in our life that turns it to a different way, or it puts us on a new path. And so I share some of those experiences or some of my amazing people that I've been able to work with to say it's not just a choice. Sometimes we don't get to make the choice at all.
I also think too that a lot of folks, unless you work in this field, like we have something called the Mental Health Act, which kind of governs what people can and can't do. And so often people will say, well, like just take them in and get them help, right? And that's like you legally cannot do that. And so I think coming from a place of education, giving people resources, explaining to people why that isn't going to happen, and to have that expectation of services and supports to be able to go out there and do that doesn't work. And there's reasons as to why. And also sharing experiences as to like maybe someone does go in, but then also, given the climate of our healthcare system, how like bed shortages, stuff like that, like people then are also discharged. So it's not as simple as, getting someone in. The wait lists are very long, all of these kind of moving parts of the systems that we're kind of working within. I know my dad, like 5 years ago when I started this work, had one opinion, and he's come very far. And he asks me what I'm doing now. He asks about my work. Like he's like, tells his friends about things. Like he donates to places. And I'm just like, never would I have thought that would have been where we are now. It was very trying conversations back in the day, but I think he was willing to listen, and he's completely changed his opinion. So it takes time and work on our end as well. But I think that, it is possible to change people's belief systems and understanding of how things work, for sure.
Thank you. If anyone else doesn't have any more to say on that topic, please, audience, raise your hands with questions. If not, Frances, I believe, may have a question to ask. Sorry to put you on the spot.
That's okay. I would love to ask a question. I actually have two, and they're both directed towards, I think, Sarah, and mostly with regards to talking about affordable housing. So you had talked about a transition into people choosing where they got to live, and I was wondering how this kind of came to be, and if you ever face like a lot of capacity issues, or how COVID might have exacerbated this with social distancing and enforcement, just kind of around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think the response to choice-based housing is brand new. You know, you go on a Toronto community housing list, you have three choices. If you don't like either of those, you're at the bottom of the list and that's it. I think it's recent as a response to the encampment clearings that now it's not just like policing people out. What do we need? What do you need to move out of this space? And what would you like, and really recognizing that people have the ability to make those choices and decide for themselves rather than somebody continuing to tell them where they should be. And I think that that's the way that the system has worked for a very, very long time. So I'm hopeful that there could be some changes and some choices. And I know that, in collaboration with other partners that we work with, people are moving to some of that direction to create spaces that people can choose to be in. But what
Yeah.
comes with that, unfortunately, as we've noticed in the hotel program, there's hotels all over the city in places that homeless people weren't previously. So there is a sense of NIMBYism sometimes. There's a lot of work and collaboration going into like community liaison and having specific teams that will go around and do community cleanup and working with the business associations throughout the city. There's a lot of work to be done. And even in that, going back to Bea's question about how do you educate people, we've had to do a lot of that, even with the business association across the city, is to say, okay, but let's educate each other. Let's figure out how to work together. And it definitely takes time.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and that kind of leads into my second question as well, because I'm curious about when it comes to creating affordable housing, how or what are some of the people and forces that are pushing for it? Is it organizations such as your house? Is it businesses that I'm sure you have to, get on your side? Are they supporting it? Is there political support? Is it government funding? I realize that this is like a very big question, but just like first thoughts.
It's all of the above. Everything kind of has to be aligned. It's space. It's providing. It's looking at the current inventory of housing that we have and how we can maybe divide it a little bit differently. What's in use? What's vacant? With all the condos going up in the city of Toronto, is there anything that we can change to make something affordable housing? As I mentioned in the chat earlier, there's a really great organization, St. Clair's Multi-Faith, and they are a housing landlord who they find ways to uniquely build and reconstruct places that already exist. They have micro units that they've been able to build onto one of their sites, which they're not big spaces, but it creates individual space. So there are some unique things going on within the city, and I think it's a push forward. And I think it's all of those things. It's funding, it's space, it's area, it's community pushing towards. We all know the housing, the price of housing is astronomically ridiculous right now. No offense. It's hard for people who have full-time jobs to afford rent and to afford housing. So how can we expect people living in poverty, and how can we continue on the trend? Really, it's gonna cap out somewhere, and we're all gonna be homeless unless we make a change to do something differently.
Yeah, that's really true. It's so difficult to find spaces for those who, are above the poverty line working full time, and to consider how to adjust for people who don't have those resources. I can only imagine how difficult it is. So thank you so much, Sarah. And I think we do have a question in the chat from Hussein. And it's, I have a question for Zara. With the growing distrust with police, it is difficult with those dealing with suicidal thoughts to speak up because they fear the police will be called. How do you navigate this with your crisis calls? Does it affect when you decide to call the police to help callers? I think that's a great question.
Yeah, great question, Hussein. In terms of dealing with callers that are having suicidal thoughts, I've navigated through a few calls like this where they are quite upfront that they don't want to tell me how severe their suicide risk is because they don't want me to call the police on them. I think what helps in these situations is to be as open, honest, and as candid as possible. I will tell them that as a part of my position as a responder, if I feel that they're about to be a danger to themselves or someone else, so it's suicide to themselves, then I will have to call the police. But that is the last thing I want to do. And the growing distrust is very much understandable. So I would make it clear that under this situation, if I feel you're about to go through with your means of suicide, I will have to call the police, but I don't want to. So it's best to just be open about how you're feeling and working through them together. So if they're telling me that their suicide risk is high, they have the means, they want to go through with the suicide, that isn't enough for me to want to call the police and intervene immediately. It's in their best interest to speak to me openly, honestly, tell me what they're feeling, and I try to de-escalate and support them the best I can. So just being open and honest and talking to them like a real person. I think that a lot of times when we're in a crisis situation, especially if it's suicide, people revert to try to sound professional or try to be very careful with their words because they don't want to trigger somebody, understandably. But what I feel has worked in my favor is to just be myself and tell them exactly what my obligations are, but how little I want to do that obligation. So let's do everything else that we can to support them so we don't have to go through that route. We have a lot of alternate options available. So if I'm able to de-escalate someone, let's say from like a high risk to a medium risk, we have options on the National Suicide Line to do a follow-up call the next day. So that's something I can always bring up and say, hey, you may have confirmed that you are safe tonight and done like a verbal confirmation that you've put your means of suicide away. But how would you like if someone just checked in on you the next day to see how you're doing? If we had discussed any action plans or goals, maybe that responder can check in with them in the follow-up call. We also have mobile crisis services. So it's not an emergency response unit, but a lot of times people seek some type of emotional support and in-person crisis intervention. So within 24 to 48 hours, we would have a crisis professional and a plain-clothed officer in an unmarked vehicle come and check on them and just see how they're doing, come up with a safety plan, come up with different options in terms of counseling or other accessible resources. So there's definitely several other things that we can do before calling the police. And I try to make that as clear as possible to the caller that I don't want to have to do that. Let's work through everything else and see how well that can support and help de-escalate the situation.
Thank you. That was a really wonderful response. If there's no, I don't know, I don't see any more questions from anybody. Are we sure?
Last call for questions.
Last call. No. Okay, it looks pretty quiet to me. Oh. Okay, no. Francis, you think no too?
I think that's all for tonight.
Oh, wait, Tenley.
Wonderful session.
Oh, thank you, Tenley.
Thank you.
It's marvelous you're addressing this, and I've learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. Oh, Reese has a question. What about minors?
Is that in terms of whether minors are suffering from suicidal thoughts or just generally dealing with minors in caller situations? I can answer both. Okay, let's just answer both. Okay. So if it's in a suicide situation, a similar principle would apply. We only call the police if we feel that they're about to be an immediate danger to themselves and to someone else. And by saying someone else, that tends to be in situations, maybe like abusive situations, so elder abuse in particular. We tend to get a lot of calls for that. So that's also the threshold that we have to calling 911. In the case of abuse with children, so we have a duty to report if we suspect that there is any sort of child abuse going on with any child under the age of 16. So if we are speaking to a minor that discloses they are suffering from abuse, or if we're speaking to a caller who alludes to some type of child being exposed to abuse, we have, okay, so I know you said suicidal minors, but I'll just keep going with this anyway. So we have to call Children's Aid Society if we feel that they're being exposed to some sort of abuse. If they are 16 or 17, then they are still protected under Children's Aid Society, but they have the option to refuse that service. So because they have increased maturity level, increased independence, and probably more options in dealing with their abusive situation, we navigate through those calls maybe a little bit differently and provide them with different options, but also let them know that Children's Aid Society can protect them. Otherwise, if it's a child under 16, the responder makes the call to Children's Aid and files that report. Hope that answered your question.
Thank you so much. And we have a thank you so much in the chat too. Perfect.
Yeah, that's great. Lots of thank yous all around. And so I think we can transition into our concluding remarks, although I will be sad too.
Yes. Okay, so overall, to conclude our panel tonight, we would just like to say a very big thank you to the Students for Shelter's executive team for making this happen. Thank you for your hard work and dedication. Everyone has done amazing in preparing all the promotional materials, securing the funding, connecting with our wonderful organizations and speakers, and thinking of all the great questions to ask our guest speakers. And so exec team, your work is incredibly appreciated by everyone at S4S. And we also want to thank all of our lovely community members for attending today in the audience. Thank you for your support. It means a lot that you're all here for our first panel of this year. And we really hope that you enjoyed all the conversations that we had tonight and that it's inspired you to continue having these conversations with people in your own community, your friends, your family. And so thank you from all of us for volunteering your time to be here tonight and to listen in on these really important things.
And when do you do it again?
Oh, I think Francis, you want to take that one? We will do it again.
Hopefully January.
Mm-hmm.
Terrific.
We'll see you there.
And now for my virtual applause. Thank you to our amazing moderator, Professor Vicky Bizbis. We always appreciate you volunteering your time and supporting our mission at S4S. Your experience and expertise is always appreciated. And a huge thank you to all of our amazing speakers here tonight, Zara from the Distress Center of Greater Toronto, and Sarah, Margot, and Jenna from Toronto North Support Services. We're so grateful that we got to partner with you and your organizations. Thank you for helping us tonight and just for all of the work you do and your expertise in the panel. I know that I personally learned so much and hopefully it's knowledge that I'll be able to relay to others in the future. So thank you so much. And thank you again, everybody, for being here. We did just want to send out actually a few mental health resources because this panel did cover quite a few sensitive topics. So I'm just going to be popping it into the chat really quickly. And hopefully everyone can get it. I tagged in U of T mental health resources and stuff from actually the Distress Center of Greater Toronto website and Toronto North Support Services. They have a bunch of amazing links to resources, numbers, people that you can call. So thank you again, everybody, so much, and good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Good night,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Thanks,
Good
guys.
night.
you.
Great
Bye.
panel, guys. Thank you so much. Bye.
You guys are fantastic.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.